They knew it was a lie. They printed it anyway. In 1862, the United States government handed the railroad companies something extraordinary: land, tens of millions of acres of it, stretching across the continent from the Missouri River to the Pacific coast. Land that the government did not entirely control, that was occupied by people who had lived on it for centuries, that had never been surveyed in any meaningful way, and that the men making the grant had never personally visited. The deal was simple: build the railroad, get the land, sell the land, profit. The problem was, the land wasn't selling. The people back east who had money to spend on western land looked at what was being offered: prairie, desert, mountain, with territory so far from anything they understood as civilization that the distance itself was a deterrent, and made a reasonable assessment. They passed. So the railroad companies did something that changed America more profoundly than the tracks themselves. They invented the West, not the physical place, the idea of it, the version that existed in print and in illustration, and eventually in the minds of millions of people who had never been west of the Mississippi, and were making decisions about their lives based on a picture that had been painted specifically to make them decide in a particular direction. They built the greatest marketing operation in American history, and it worked so well that 150 years later, we are still living inside what it created. Stay with me, because this is the story behind every story, even the machinery that produced the myth. The men who built it, what they knew, what they chose not to say, and what it cost the people who believed them. The railroads needed settlers. This is the foundation of everything that follows. The land grants gave the companies millions of acres, but land without people on it generated no revenue. The revenue model required settlers, farmers who would buy the land, work it, produce crops, and then ship those crops east on the railroad. Every settler who bought a quarter section of Kansas prairie was a customer. Every bushel of wheat that traveled from a Kansas farm to a Chicago market was revenue. The settlers were not the beneficiaries of the railroad's generosity. They were the product. They were what the railroad was selling to its investors as proof that the model worked. And to get settlers, you needed a story. The story that existed about the land west of the Missouri River in the 1860s was not helpful to the railroad's purposes. The Great Plains, the vast grassland stretching from the Missouri to the Rockies, was known to the people who had been there as the Great American Desert. This was not a metaphor. It was the term that explorers and cartographers and military surveyors had used for decades to describe a landscape that received insufficient rainfall for conventional agriculture, that baked in summer heat and froze in winter cold, and that the people actually living on it, the Plains nations who had adapted to it over centuries, had survived through methods that were entirely incompatible with the wheat farming that the railroad needed its settlers to practice. The Great American Desert was on the maps. The railroad companies needed it off the maps, so they hired people to put something else there instead. The land offices that the railroad companies established in the 1860s and 70s were not real estate agencies in any conventional sense. They were propaganda operations with real estate functions. They produced literature, pamphlets, brochures, guidebooks, newspaper supplements, in quantities that the printing technology of the period had only recently made economically feasible, and they distributed this literature across the eastern United States and across Europe with a systematic thoroughness that no previous promotional campaign had approached. The literature described a place that did not exist, no, not in the crude sense of inventing geographical features or falsifying maps. in the more sophisticated sense of selecting, emphasizing, omitting, and framing. The land was described in terms that activated the deepest aspirations of the people being targeted: fertile, productive, mild, opportunity waiting to be claimed by anyone willing to work for it. The American dream made literal, actual land, actually available, actually yours if you were willing to go get it. The rainfall numbers in railroad promotional material were not fabricated. They were carefully selected from the wettest years on record and presented as representative. The growing seasons described were not invented. They were the best growing seasons the region had experienced, presented without the context that would have explained how unusual they were. The soil descriptions were not false. They were accurate descriptions of the topsoil that existed. Without the information about what happened to that topsoil when the drought years came and the wind picked up, everything stated was technically defensible. Everything omitted was the part that mattered. The railroad companies also employed, directly or indirectly, a network of writers and journalists whose output served the promotional purpose, without being explicitly identified as promotional material. Travel writers were given free passage on railroad lines in exchange for articles describing the journey and the territories through which it passed. Journalists were hosted on promotional excursions that showed them the best of what the land had to offer and allowed them to write enthusiastically about it without technically being on the railroad's payroll. The line between journalism and promotion in this period was not a line so much as a suggestion. The newspapers that ran this content were not uniformly cynical about it. Many editors genuinely believed that the West offered what the promotional material claimed it offered. The boosterism that characterized American newspaper coverage of Western development in the 1860s and 70s was not entirely manufactured. It was also genuine belief in a national narrative of expansion and progress that the papers both reflected and amplified. But genuine belief and accurate information are not the same thing. And the people making decisions about whether to sell their farm in Ohio and move their family to Kansas were not always able to distinguish between a newspaper article written by a journalist who had spent 3 weeks on a railroad promotional tour in an unusually wet summer and an objective assessment of whether Kansas could support a farm through a decade of variable rainfall. They read the article, they looked at the land prices, they made the decision, and then they went. The scale of what followed is difficult to absorb as a single number. Between 1862 and 1890, the population of the Great Plains increased from a few 100,000 to several million. Hundreds of thousands of individual families made individual decisions to relocate to land they had never seen, based on information produced by parties with a direct financial interest in those families making exactly that decision. They came from the American East. They came from Germany and Scandinavia and Russia and the British Isles, recruited by railroad agents who operated offices in European cities specifically to find and motivate immigrants who might be persuaded to settle on American land. The railroad's European recruitment operation was sophisticated, targeted, and multilingual. It found communities with agricultural traditions, communities with the skills to work land if the land was workable, and it told those communities what it needed them to believe. They came. They found the land, and the land was not what the pamphlet said. The first years were sometimes deceptive. The 1870s brought above-average rainfall to parts of the Great Plains, enough to encourage the belief that the promotional material had been accurate. Crops grew, towns formed, the infrastructure of permanent settlement, churches, schools, local newspapers, local governments, began to establish itself with the confidence of people who believed they were building something that would last. There was a saying that circulated in agricultural circles during this period: rain follows the plow. The idea, which had actual scientific proponents and was not simply a piece of folk wisdom, held that cultivation itself changed the climate, that breaking the sod and planting crops somehow increased the moisture retention of the soil and the rainfall of the region, that the act of settlement was transforming the land into the thing the promotional material had promised it would be. This was not true. The rainfall of the Great Plains was not changed by the presence of settlers. It was determined by large-scale atmospheric patterns that operated entirely independently of what was happening on the ground beneath them. When those patterns shifted, when the drought years came, as they had always come and would always come to the Great Plains, the crops failed with a completeness that the good years had not prepared anyone for. 1874, the grasshoppers came, not a few grasshoppers, not a pest problem of the kind that farming always involves. A plague of grasshoppers so vast that contemporary accounts describe the sky darkening as they arrived, when the sound of their descent audible from miles away, the weight of them bending and breaking the crops they landed on. They ate everything: crops, wooden tool handles, leather harnesses, the curtains on the windows of the houses that settlers had built, with the conviction that they were building something permanent. They stripped the fields in hours. Families that had spent years building toward self-sufficiency found themselves with nothing, not reduced harvests, nothing, the work of years gone in a day, the supplies that were supposed to carry them through winter consumed by an insect swarm that the promotional literature had not mentioned, because the promotional literature did not mention things that discouraged settlement. The federal government provided some relief, not enough, not fast enough, not organized enough to reach everyone who needed it before the winter came. People left, not everyone. The ones who stayed through the grasshoppers rebuilt. Some of them were destroyed again by the drought years that followed in the late 1870s. Some of those rebuilt again. The people who ultimately made successful lives on the Great Plains were not the ones for whom the promotional material turned out to be accurate. They were the ones who survived long enough and adapted thoroughly enough to the actual conditions of the land, not the conditions described in the pamphlet, to build something that worked in reality rather than in the promise. But many of them didn't make it that far. And the ones who didn't, the ones who spent their savings and their years on land that the drought took, and the grasshoppers took, and the winter took, they are not in the story the West tells about itself. The story the West tells about itself is about the ones who stayed and succeeded, about resilience and determination and the American character expressing itself in hardship and coming through. That story is real. It happened. The people who built lasting lives on the Great Plains were remarkable in ways that deserve acknowledgement. But the people who came and failed and left or died, they were also real. They were also remarkable in their own way, willing to risk everything on a promise, willing to work past the point that most people would have stopped. I destroyed ultimately not by any failure of character or effort, but by a gap between what they had been told and what was true. That gap was not accidental. It was constructed. The men who constructed it were not in Kansas when the grasshoppers came. They were in offices in Chicago and New York and Boston, looking at land sale figures and railroad revenue numbers, and the overall progress of the project of populating the continent with people who would generate freight. They knew the drought years came. The geological and meteorological record of the Great Plains was not secret. The indigenous peoples who had lived on that land for centuries had built their entire existence around the variability of the climate. The cycles of wet and dry that the land moved through on timescales longer than a single growing season. And the Army surveys that had preceded settlement had documented conditions that the promotional literature directly contradicted. The men running the land operations had access to information that their customers did not. They chose what to share. The dime novels were a different operation, but served the same function, where the railroad promotional material targeted the practical decision-making of potential settlers. Here is the land. Here is the price. Here is what it can produce. The dime novels targeted something deeper and less rational. They sold an identity, a version of the West where the defining quality was not agricultural productivity, but something more intoxicating. Freedom, danger, the possibility of becoming something larger than what you were. The dime novel industry emerged in the 1860s and reached its peak in the 70s and 80s, producing thousands of titles that sold millions of copies to readers across the country and eventually across the world. The books were cheap, a dime, hence the name, and they were everywhere. Train stations, general stores, anywhere that people gathered and waited and needed something to read. The stories they told were not subtle. Heroes with names that communicated their qualities directly. Deadwood Dick, Buffalo Bill, Wild Bill Hickok, fictionalized beyond any relationship to the actual man. Gunfights that lasted pages and ended with justice delivered cleanly. Landscapes that offered danger but rewarded courage. A West where the rules were simple and the worthy man prevailed, and the promise of the land was real for anyone willing to be hard enough to claim it. These stories were not written by people who had been West. They were written in New York offices by authors who were producing content on deadline for publishers who understood exactly what their readership wanted and had no particular obligation to provide anything more accurate than what sold. The most successful dime novel author of the period, Edward Wheeler, creator of Deadwood Dick, produced over 30 novels in the series without, as far as historians can determine, spending significant time in the actual West. When he was writing fantasy set in a geography he understood primarily through the promotional literature and the accounts of other writers who had also understood it primarily through promotional literature. The feedback loop was complete. The promotional material created an image. The dime novels amplified and romanticized that image. The newspapers covered Western events through the lens that both the promotional material and the dime novels had created. The readers who consumed all of this developed a picture of the West that was internally consistent and emotionally compelling and almost entirely disconnected from the physical reality of the place. And then they made decisions based on that picture. Buffalo Bill Cody understood this better than anyone. His Wild West show, which began in 1883 and toured for decades, eventually performing for European royalty and audiences in the tens of millions, was not presented as fiction. It was presented as authentic recreation, real cowboys, real Native Americans, real frontier skills demonstrated by people who had actually lived the frontier life. It was theater. Staged, scripted, choreographed theater with real performers and real horses and real guns, firing blank cartridges in carefully planned sequences designed to produce maximum entertainment while telling a specific story about what the West was and what it meant. The story it told was the one the promotional material had established and the dime novels had elaborated. The brave settler, the noble lawman, the savage threat defeated by American courage and American skill. The frontier as the place where American identity had been forged and proven. I, Sitting Bull, performed in the show for one season. The man who had led the forces that defeated Custer at Little Bighorn, one of the most consequential military victories in the history of the Plains Wars, rode in circles in an arena while the audience that had been taught to see him as a savage threat watched him with the fascination of people looking at something safely contained. He was paid for it. He used the money to buy food for the people on the reservation who were hungry. He reportedly said, watching the audience that came to see him, that he could not understand a people who had so much and gave so little to those who had nothing. The show told a story. He was living in a different one. The consequences of the myth were not abstract. They were measured in families. In the specific individual, I had documented stories of people who made decisions based on information that had been curated to serve someone else's interest. A family from Sweden reads a railroad pamphlet translated into Swedish by a railroad agent based in Stockholm, whose salary depends on the number of families he convinces to purchase land in Minnesota. The pamphlet describes rich soil and mild winters, an opportunity waiting for anyone willing to work. The family sells what they have. They cross the Atlantic. They cross the American continent on the railroad that sold them the pamphlet. They arrive at their land in October. The winter that follows is not mild. They survive it, barely. They plant in spring, and the crops grow, and they begin to believe that the hard part is over. The second winter is worse than the first. The third year brings drought. The fourth year the grasshoppers come. By the fifth year they have spent everything they brought and borrowed against the land, and the land is producing less than it costs to work it. They are not in any record that history preserved with their names attached. They are in the statistics, in the land sale records that show parcels changing hands multiple times as original buyers failed and sold to the next wave of buyers who had read the same pamphlet. In the population records of counties that boomed and then contracted as the people who couldn't make it work drained away and left behind the ones who could. The myth survived all of this, not despite the failures, partly because of them. Because the failures were individual and the myth was collective. A family that lost everything in Kansas in 1876 lost it quietly, privately, in a way that didn't make the newspapers and didn't challenge the promotional narrative that was still bringing new families in behind them. The myth was renewed constantly by the arrival of new believers, each wave of whom was too recent to have experienced what the previous wave had learned. By the time the frontier officially closed, the Census Bureau announced in 1890 that a continuous frontier line could no longer be identified. The myth had become self-sustaining. It no longer needed the railroad pamphlets to survive. It had been absorbed into the national identity so completely that it generated its own perpetuation. The dime novels became Wild West shows. The Wild West shows became silent films. The silent films became the golden age westerns that defined Hollywood's first decades. When the Hollywood westerns became the television westerns that ran for 30 years on American screens. The television westerns became the prestige films and streaming series that are still being produced now. Each iteration refined the myth, smoothed its edges, made it more visually compelling, more emotionally sophisticated, better at delivering the experience that audiences had been trained to want. And each iteration moved further from the physical reality of the place and the people the myth was built on. The railroad companies are gone. The promotional offices are closed. The pamphlets are in archives, preserved under acid-free paper, readable by anyone willing to look at them. They are extraordinary documents, not because they are crude or obvious in their manipulation, because they are not. They are careful, specific, I'm technically accurate in their claims and devastating in their omissions. They are the work of people who understood exactly what they were doing and did it with professional competence and without apparent discomfort. They knew the drought years came. They knew the grasshoppers came. They knew that the rainfall figures they were presenting were selected from the best years, rather than the average years. They printed the pamphlets anyway. They mailed them to Sweden and Germany and Ohio and Pennsylvania and New York. And the families came, and the West took from them what the West takes from everyone who arrives, believing a story that was written by someone who needed them to believe it. The myth was the product. The settlers were the price. And the price was paid quietly, individually, privately, in sod houses, on drought-stricken prairies, and in mining camps full of mercury vapor, and in the specific silence of a family that has lost everything and has no language for what has happened to them, because the language available, the language of the dime novels and the promotional pamphlets and the newspaper stories, describes a place where this wasn't supposed to happen, where hard work was supposed to be enough, where the land was supposed to give back what you put into it, where the story was supposed to end differently. The story ended the way it ended. The pamphlets are still in the archives. The land is still there. And the gap between what was promised and what was true, that gap is still exactly as wide as it always was. It was just papered over so thoroughly that most people stopped being able to see it. That was the point. That was always the point.